telemedicine was a nice segue to this project. We received grant funding to do an evaluation of methods for increasing access to parent training in children with ASD using telehealth or telemedicine. And just to start with, we use the term parent training or parent-mediated intervention. What we're talking about is specific training programs that teach parents strategies to support their child's social communication development and to reduce behavior problems. And when we look at the outcomes across a wide variety of research being conducted in this area, we find very strong support that parent-mediated intervention can lead to positive family outcomes or parent outcomes, particularly in the area of increased ability to actually implement the intervention strategies with fidelity, as well as increased self-efficacy among parents who've received training and decreased parenting stress. And this is very important because we know that families of children with ASD experience significant stress. When we look at the child outcomes of parent-mediated interventions, we see evidence for decreased behavior problems in children whose parents have been trained to carry out intervention strategies, as well as increased social communication. And this is an area I'm very interested in, is the development of social communication skills in young children with ASD. So when we take this research together, it's been conducted by my lab as well as a number of other researchers across US and elsewhere, we see that there's a strong evidence base for considering parent-mediated intervention and evidence-based practice in the treatment of children with ASD. However, when we actually look at the actual implementation in community settings, we see that less than about 25% of children with ASD in the preschool years actually receive parent-mediated intervention. So we know it's an evidence-based practice, but there's a huge disconnect between what we know works and what's actually being received in the field. So we are particularly interested in my lab on ways to increase access to parent-mediated intervention. And one potential approach is the use of telehealth, which is the delivery of health information over the internet. And this can be done in a number of ways. One particular approach is self-directed telehealth programs where parents use online training, such as hybrid instruction like you might see with an online undergraduate course. We also see therapist-assisted programs where parents work with a provider via some sort of teleconferencing to receive feedback on their use of strategies. One of the nice things about telehealth is it can surmount many of the barriers to receiving parent-mediated intervention that occur when you don't have providers trained in the area. And because of this, there's a very strong potential for telehealth to increase access in underserved communities, including rural communities and as well as low-resource countries. So we've been very interested in the development of a telehealth version of our existing parent-mediated intervention. And to this extent, we developed ImPACT Online with the support of the Department of Defense's Autism Research Program, which is a includes both a self-directed program, 12 lessons where parents can work through it over the course of about 3 months, as well as a therapist-assisted version of this program where parents work through the program on their own and then receive online coaching from a coach using teleconferencing. So we actually conducted a pilot of these 2 versions of the program over the last few years, and we recently were able to analyze those data, and we found a high level of engagement with the online program and high levels of acceptability, suggesting this is a potential approach that families do value. We found improvements in parent and child skills, which is the ultimate outcomes we're looking for. And given the data that we have so far, we see a high potential for the ability to use the self-directed version of the program to disseminate this program widely to families. And one thing I want to mention is in part of our evaluation, we did qualitative interviews with parents, and we asked them, when would you like to have received information about this program? And kind of 201, parents reported, I would have liked to have heard about this as soon as my child was diagnosed. So there's a lot of excitement about the possibility of telehealth, but what we don't actually know is whether or not what seems promising in lab-based trials will actually translate into the real world, because these are families that have called us up and said, we would like to participate in your research-based study where we come into the lab because we so value the use of telehealth. So when these parents are reporting to us that they would have liked to have heard about it at the time their child was diagnosed, we don't really know if that is exactly mirrored by the population at large. And so really, for telehealth to have the impact that we would really like, we really have to understand how it's being used in the real world. community access. So what we were able to do with the funding from RAIN was we were able to run a side study that is really looking at dissemination potential and effectiveness as opposed to true efficacy. And to do this, we are running an open access trial. Our aim is to recruit 200 families. We have about 100 right now. We have some sub-analyses with a subset of these families where we are looking at whether or not parents are enrolling and how parents are enrolling. We are looking at dissemination potential by looking at the reach of the program, the demographics of the families that enroll to determine whether they're similar to the families that are enrolling in our lab-based trials. We're looking at program engagement as well as acceptability. And then ultimately, we're also looking at effectiveness, and we'll be testing whether or not any of these aspects of program engagement are related to that. So we just did a brief analysis. We're no means done with our analyses, but just to give you a little taste of the data. When we look at the reach, this is, what we did is we looked at providers that gave out information about this program at the time of diagnosis. This is when families said they wanted it. And then we looked at what percentage of those families actually accessed the program. We found only about 20%, only about 20% of families provided information at the time of their child's diagnosis actually logged in, suggesting that there is a big disconnect there and that there's room for increasing access. We also looked at demographics, and we found that the demographics of families that enrolled in the open access trial were quite similar to those that enrolled in our online, in our in-person lab-based trial, suggesting that the families that are accessing it are actually relatively similar to those families that access research-based interventions. Then we looked at the engagement with the program in the families that participated or enrolled through the open access trial versus those that enrolled in the lab-based trial. We see really different usage behaviors with the families that enrolled in a lab-based study. Although they were provided with the same level of support, they were engaging with the program at significantly higher rates, suggesting that we need to do a better job of following along families when we give them information. Just because you build it, they may not come. We also looked at acceptability, and we saw high rates of acceptability among our open access users, but they were significantly lower than the acceptability of the program among the families that chose to enroll in lab-based trial. And then finally, our questions are, we're just tapping whether or not we have any effectiveness data, but looking at parent outcomes, we found increases in parent knowledge in the open access group, and that was related to the percent of the amount of the program they actually did. So engaging in the program actually is a predictor of how much improvement we see in parent knowledge. We also saw an increase in parent self-efficacy, but no change in parenting stress. And in terms of child outcomes, we saw increases in communication, but no changes in social skills. And this actually was similar to our findings in our lab-based trials. So the outcomes are similar, but what we're finding is lower rates of engagement, less acceptability, and a very low reach. So I think that tells us a lot about the dissemination potential of these types of interventions. We need to think more about how to disseminate them and to get them in the hands of users that we ultimately want. So, one other thing I just want to say as a plug for RAIN is the RAIN funding allowed us to leverage some of this data to a large HRSA grant. So we are now able to do a large-scale randomized comparative efficacy study of the telehealth program. So, thank you.